All right, so to begin with, I just kind of wanted to go over some of the technical things with the AP Biology exam, just in case you weren't familiar with how it's set up. But basically, it's a 90-minute session for Section 1, so it's an hour and a half for Section 1, which is multiple choice and gridded questions. So 63 multiple choice questions. There will be A, B, C, or D as the choices, so only 4 choices. And then there will be 6 grid-in responses. So that would be something that will require some kind of a calculation, and you'll have to grid in an answer, a numerical answer for those 6 grid-in responses. And Section 1 counts for 50% of your total score. And then Section 2 is where the free response questions will be. You get another 90 minutes, hour and a half for this section. However, the first 10 minutes are a reading and planning time. So for the first 10 minutes of that section, you'll get time to read over all of the questions and plan what answers you will, how your answers will kind of be orchestrated. And then you'll have the additional 80 minutes to actually write. And the way that it's set up is that there are 2 long free response questions. So one of those is usually lab or database. And so that's about 25% of the overall second section, and they're graded on a 0 to 10 point scale for those 2 long response. And then you'll have 6 short free response questions that require about a paragraph length response. Do not use bullets for those. They do need to be written in complete sentences. And how they're graded is 3 of those 6 will be a 3-point scale and 3 will be a 4-point scale. And so Section 2 is 50%. 25% is from the 6 short free response and 25% is from the 2 long free response. So that's how the 2 sections are set up. First section is the multiple choice. Second section is the free response writing. The content that's covered is based on those 4 main big ideas. Evolution's one of the big ideas. Cellular processes, energy and communication is the second one. The third big idea is genetics and information transfer. And then the fourth one is interaction. So as we go through the different reviews, we'll be covering the many subtopics that go under those big ideas. And you can even download, and I put it on our course webpage under the AP exam, the AP Biology course and exam description, and so that kind of goes through detailed explanation of what each of the big ideas consist of. Back to the multiple choice and the grid-in. So again, it's 63 questions for the multiple choice. It requires more reading than has been required in previous exams, so you're going to have lots of paragraphs and diagrams or data analysis to look at while trying to answer the multiple choice. And the grid-in, again, are going to be incorporating that math and being able to do calculations. So you'll have to calculate the correct answer and bubble in the grid. And I'll show you an example with some of our practice questions of what the grid will look like. And you'll need to bring a 4-function calculator. I'm not sure. Some schools provide them, some don't, so I would definitely just have one just in case. But it's 4-function calculator with a square root to use on the exam. And you also get a formula list that you'll be able to use for whether it's the free response questions or the multiple choice. And it looks like this. This is one page of the formula list, and so you can see it's got, standard error of mean. It's got the standard deviation, mean, metric prefixes, what mode, median, mean, range all mean. The second page has got more about rate and growth, water potential, surface area, volume. Probably more than you would really ever need, but it does provide all of these for you. Okay. With the multiple choice, pacing is important. We say to kind of give yourself about a minute per multiple choice and 3 minutes for the grid-in, since you have to do some calculation. But keep in mind that there's no penalty for guessing. So answer every question. If you don't know something and you want to skip it and come back to it, that's fine. You can maybe mark it or whatever, but make sure you at least fill in something. Don't just leave any question blank, because there is no penalty for getting anything wrong. You're only grade scored on what you earn or what you get correct, so you might as well answer them all. If some calculations are needed, or if you need more time to kind of think about it, again, you can skip it and come back to it, and you can make a mark in the test booklet so that you know to come back to it. But definitely just do make sure you give an answer. The lab set questions are tedious, so the suggestion is that if there's a diagram and data to look at, to just kind of skim the questions first, and then go back to that diagram and data to see what you need to look for. Because sometimes you can get lost in all the information that they're providing you in data. Yeah, that's a good way to do that, because it can be so overwhelming, and they tend to give you way more than you need. So definitely make sure you focus on what the question's asking for. And then, another good tip is to underline keywords such as not or except, because those tend to be things that students sometimes skim over and forget. So you don't want to answer it incorrectly because you forgot that, disclaimer of not, or what's it, except this. Read each answer choice before making a selection, because you want to make sure that you've eliminated anything that's not possible. And don't be afraid to use that test booklet and cross out the letters of incorrect choices so that you can narrow it down, especially if you're not sure between a couple. Go ahead and cross out the ones that don't make any sense at all. But last, again, I can't stress enough, if you absolutely don't know it, go ahead and guess. Just, don't leave it blank. You're better off, earning the point maybe if you get it right. You never know. If you finish early, of course, always go back and double check anything. With the free response, best planning period during that 10-minute reading period, the best plan of action is to skim each of the questions and kind of figure out which one you think is going to be the easiest, and prioritize them, easiest to hardest. And start organizing your thoughts, and you can outline essays on the sheet provided. So you actually get a sheet that you can kind of jot down some thoughts and ideas on how you want to approach these essays. Again, underline or circle any of the keywords, and make sure you address each of the directives. So we talked about this before. You want to make sure that you answer every single part of the question that's being asked. Don't leave anything out, and really kind of pay attention to what's being asked. If it's asking you to compare, you need to make sure you give similarities and differences. Contrast is just differences. Describe, explain as much detail as you can, including a definition. So don't forget about specifics. Pretend like the person reading it does not have any idea what they are doing and don't know anything about the topic. Okay. If there are several parts, make sure you answer them in sequence. That helps the reader out, and you don't want to frustrate the reader who's scoring your essay, so make sure you write the answers in sequence. Make sure you write an essay, use complete sentences. Don't give bullet points or outlines, because a lot of times that's too vague, and so they're not going to know what you're referring to. So make sure you are specific. If you draw a diagram, which is allowed to help answer a question, just make sure that they're labeled so that the reader knows what you're trying to reference and show. Any calculations, this is really important, because this is something a lot of science students tend to forget. If you have something that requires a calculation, you must show all your work. You have to show each step and remember the units. A lot of times science students want to just give the answer, or want to kind of skip over a couple steps because it's a basic thing, or it takes too long to write it out, especially online. You don't want to type it all out and that kind of thing. When you're doing these exams, you've got to make sure you show every single step, because a lot of times you will not get credit if you don't show your work, even if the answer is correct. If you see any buzzwords, make sure you define or describe them. So if it's asking you to explain about, explain about how phenotype and genotype are related together, make sure you also define those words. Define genotype, define phenotype. Make sure that you give those details. More is better, as long as you're not contradicting anything that you have previously said. And again, don't leave any part of the essay blank. You might as well, if you're not, as long as you're not contradicting anything, you will not get marked down. You're only going to gain marks for what you've done correctly. So each point is worth 2 times a multiple choice point, so it's definitely in your best interest to answer every part of the essay. Let's see here. If time allows, proofread and be kind to the readers. You want to use good handwriting. Even though I know when we're in a hurry and we're under time constraints, sometimes it can get sloppy, but try to use your best handwriting as possible. If printing is easier to read than cursive, then print. So that way there's no question as to what you're trying to write. You don't want the reader, having to try to figure out what you're trying to say. On test day, we suggest that you arrive 30 minutes before the start time. You definitely want to get there, early. Plan to be there earlier than the start time, just in case you hit traffic or whatever. You don't want to get, stuck and then not be able to take the test. Eat a breakfast. Bring a photo ID, because you do have to verify who you are. Make sure you have enough sharpened pencils with clean erasers, ballpoint pens as well for the essays. I would suggest having a watch. You can't have your phone or anything in there, so a watch is something that you are allowed to have. That way you can help, keep an idea of time, even though there usually are clocks in the classroom, but just in case. Have your 4-function calculator, and then again, remember that you're not allowed to have any books, any notes, any cameras, cell phones, anything like that. They're not allowed in there, so just keep that in mind. Okay. Did you have any questions about any of that on the biology exam? No? All right. Then we'll move on to the ecology review. So just kind of want to go over some of the main topics under the ecology unit and just kind of freshen up on those with you. So first thing is just to remember that ecology is the study of life and the interactions between that life and the environment. So it includes both the biotic and the abiotic factors that are in an ecosystem. His favorite part of science. Good. A lot of people like this because it makes more sense to everyone than some of the other stuff. So just remember, biotic is the living parts. Abiotic, A means without, so that is the non-living part. So like temperature, water, salinity, humidity, sunlight, soil, all of those things would be the abiotic. And so ecology has both of those. The hierarchy, you want to be a paleontologist, well, definitely will play a part in that. You definitely need to know about ecology for that. The way it tends to organize is the biggest, the most general and all-inclusive part of ecology is the biosphere. That's the global ecosystem. We get a little bit more specific when we go into an actual ecosystem. That's all the abiotic factors and the community of species in a certain area. So we have, Florida has its own ecosystem, and then there's even smaller ecosystems within Florida if you talk about the wetlands versus swamps and stuff like that. A community is going to be all the organisms of all the species that inhabit a particular area. So it's multiple species, but it's just talking about the species only, whereas ecosystem would be including those abiotic factors into that, okay? And then on a smaller scale, we have just a population, which is going to be the same species of a group living in a specific area. So it's one species at a population level. And then the organism would be the individual. All right. If we look at demography, the study of the vital statistics that affect our population, demography, we can look at how additions occur through birth and subtractions occur through death. Okay, so the population size is added by with our birth, and any population size is subtracted through death. So there are a couple different ways we can look at that. A life table is an age-specific summary of the survival pattern of a population, and we're going to look at some of those. And then we also can do graphs, which are the survivorship curves, which we talked a little bit about the other day when we did your DBA. So that's another way of looking at how populations are changing based on age and births and deaths. Okay. So here's some examples of those survivorship curves. A type 1 curve is going to be more like humans and other larger type mammals. We have a low death rate early in life, and most individuals when born will survive, and then as we age, that number of population decreases as we get closer to the 100. A type 2 is a constant death rate over the lifespan. So basically the deaths and the births are kind of happening at an equal rate. So that's something like squirrels. That's going to have more of just a straight plane down from their births to number of population at birth to death. And then the type 3 is the high death rate early in life, and those are going to be more of those R-selected species in which there's a ton of births done at the beginning because not very many survive to begin with, so a lot will die off at the beginning. Perhaps, exactly. All right, so there's not as many that last longer into life. Zero population growth is when the births equal the deaths. So there's no population growth at all if those two numbers equal. Exponential population growth, and this is going to be one of our curves that we talked about. Oops, I just lost my page. Here we go. So when we look at this, we can see that the population size is kind of growing at an exponential amount. The number of generations, and it's just continuing to grow. And basically this is when there are ideal conditions and the population is growing very rapidly and there's no reproduction constraints. Doesn't usually last very long because there's going to be some kind of, you know, elimination of resources at some point. Exactly, outside factors. There's, you know, no way for this to really maintain for a long period of time. But I just kind of wanted you to see what this looks like, this the exponential growth pattern looks like. And again, this would be what you would see with our selected species, where you're going to have a lot of birth and initially, but it's not going to be able to last very long. And just so you know what the different letters in these numbers mean that they've done with the slope here. You've got the change in the number of individuals is what the D, capital N, represents. That's the change in the number of individuals. The D with the lowercase t is the change in time. R is the rate of growth, and N is the number of individuals. So in this case, 1 is the R, and 0.5 is the R on the black line. It's the rate of growth. So this compared to the logistic model, which is what humans tend to follow and what most species for the most part follow, is when we've got this logistic where we've got a carrying capacity. So you have basically an actual cap to how much that ecosystem can sustain, because the resources are not going to be unlimited. The likelihood of resources being unlimited is rare. So K equals that carrying capacity, that maximum stable population that can be sustained by that environment. And so we're kind of capped at that point. So it gives us more of that S-shaped curve. And it's a more realistic curve of what a population is going to look like. All right, and then we talked a little bit about this, the K-selected versus the R-selected. K-selected, again, is more like what humans would be found in, you know, elephants, any of our more complex organisms. The population is going to be close to the carrying capacity. We're going to try to get as close to those limited resources as possible, but kind of stay under there, because if we go above it, then we're in trouble. We have high prenatal care, low birth numbers, because most of the young end up surviving. There's a good survival of our young. It is density dependent. And then R-selected is that reproductive selected species in which they have maximum reproductive success. They got a lot of birth early on, little to no care of their young because not many of them will end up surviving, and they tend to be more density independent. And their lifespans are definitely much shorter because of this. All right, so some factors that limit the population growth, density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. So the difference between these, density-dependent means that the population matters. So these are going to be things like disease, competition, the resources available, waste accumulation, predation. Whereas density independent is going to be factors that don't matter about the population. The population is not a factor in it at all. So a natural disaster like a fire or flood or weather, those would be density independent factors that would have an impact on the population. It's not that a fire happening would affect that population regardless of how big it is, how small it is, anything like that. And that's why it's called density independent. So that's just a breakdown on those two terms. Any questions so far? I don't want to go too fast, but I know I got a lot to cover. Okay. All right. So here are those age structure diagrams, which are kind of interesting. So this kind of puts it in a different perspective. It gives you an idea of the size of the population at different ages as you go through. So like you can see here in Kenya, we have a large number of population down in the younger ages, and then it gets it tends to get very small as we move up. Even starting at age 30 and above, the population starts to drop pretty drastically. The United States, we tend to have a slow growth, so ours is pretty stable as you go through the ages of the population. So that's kind of interesting, and that's probably because we are not a third world country. We have very good health care, and we take care of our elders, and so it's not just a magic drop off as soon as they start to hit a certain age. And even in Italy, you can see there is a very small change in the population, and as they go through as well. All right, so then we can talk a little bit about how organisms in an ecosystem interact with one another and how that affects them. So we can have positive interactions, negative interactions, or neutral interactions, and they include competition, predation, and symbiosis. So competition is considered a neutral interaction because it can be detrimental to both species or beneficial to both species. It just kind of depends on the competition. So one species is not going to necessarily be at an advantage over another one. You're both going to be competing for basically the same thing. So competition is considered neutral. Predation, on the other hand, is considered positive to one species and negative to the other, and that's because, of course, one species is gaining a food source and the other species is being killed, so that's one's being harmed, the other one's not. Herbivory is the same way. This would be things like thorns on a tree or chemical chase, to deter predators, those types of things. Thorns. What's another one? Trying to think of all the different examples. Plants. Smells is another one. So basically it's beneficial to the one that has that protection, whether it be the thorns or the bad smell or the poison, whatever they have. They're benefiting by surviving, whereas the other individual is not getting their food source, so that's detrimental to the other one, or they're getting harmed in the process. Parasitism, again, one organism benefits because they are actually gaining their nutrients off of the other species which is being harmed in the process. Disease, again, would be beneficial to the pathogen and detrimental to the species that it's affecting. Mutualism is where we have both being positive. So mutualism is where the interaction is beneficial to both species. So an example of this is flowers and bees have mutualistic relationships because they both are able to gain something from that relationship. And then commensalism is where we've got one benefiting and the other one is neutral. The other one's not being harmed or benefited. So like a nest of a bird in a tree would be an example. The bird's benefiting from that nest being in the tree and the protection of the tree. It doesn't really do any harm to the tree itself. So the tree's not benefiting or being harmed in either way. So interspecific competition will occur when resources are short in supply. And again, the species interaction, they're both going to be affected by that competition, and they both can be affected negatively. So this brings us to the competitive exclusion principle, and this just means that two species which cannot coexist in a community if their niches are identical. So every species has its unique niche to fill in that community, and one of the species will either have an advantage to eliminate the other one eventually, or they will have to move to another community. Something will happen. You cannot have two species occupying the same niche in an ecosystem or community. So that is where invasive species become problematic, because a lot of times they will come in to a community that was already there, and they will take over the niche from something that was native and cause that native to have to either move if they can, or to die out and become extinct, which is not something we want to see when it's a non-native species that's come in to do that. Okay, so no two species can coexist in an identical niche. And ecological niches can be broken down into two main different parts. There's the fundamental niche, which is basically what could be potentially occupied by the species. So you can see here in this picture to the right, we have this barnacle here that its fundamental niche is the entire part of this cliff, both outside of the cliff and under where the low tide would still be reaching it in the ocean. So fundamentally, this particular species could occupy that entire niche. However, the realized niche is what they actually only occupy. So they both can still be here. There's a different species now in there, but because that other species is there, the first one only occupies the one area outside of the ocean that becomes dry during, or becomes wet during high tide but dry during low tide, because they can survive in both, whereas the other one looks like it tends to need more of that water, and so that's why it has occupied that lower niche. And so they are able to live in the same area, but they really are still only occupying two different niches, and have been able to do that together successfully. But if for some reason the one above it, I don't know how to say the name of this particular barnacle, I just know it's a barnacle, the Chastlalamus, if for some reason they were only able to occupy that entire thing, if they still needed some of that water, then they would be competing, and whoever had the reproductive success would be the one that would survive and be occupying that particular niche. So again, it's fundamental is what they might be able to, but realized is what they actually do. So sometimes organisms could occupy more than one area, but because of a need being filled by another organism, they only occupy a different niche that's necessary, because they are able to adapt in that way. Kind of like if a person has multiple skills, you may be an awesome musician, but you also may be really good mechanic, and maybe, you know, you you don't necessarily get a gig being a musician when you are older, and so you end up occupying the niche as the mechanic instead. Doesn't mean that you couldn't do the musician if you had to, but you're only realizing part of it. Yeah, good. Okay. All right, with predation, I just wanted to kind of review some of the defensive adaptations that are found in predation. So some things that organisms will use to help keep themselves from being the prey. So you have cryptic coloration. And cryptic coloration is just when an organism camouflages by coloring, so they're able to blend into their environment. Warning coloration is when an organism will have bright colors that are similar to what a poisonous animal might have. So usually like oranges are key color for poison, and so they will also be orange. So it's not that they're actually trying to mimic the pattern, but they are going to have some of the same colors as another poisonous animal might have. So it's just a warning color that someone might be, well, maybe this thing is poisonous, even though they aren't. Batesian mimicry is when a harmless species mimics the color of a harmful species. So that's seen with the butterflies. We see that with the monarch butterflies. So they mimic the same coloration patterns as the harmful species so that it helps protect them as well. Whereas Müllerian mimicry is where two bad-tasting species resemble each other. So they actually are both avoided. So they both have a bad taste, or they have a bad smell or something, so that they mimic each other, and then therefore they are both going to be avoided. And then the herbivory that I was talking about earlier, these are things like the chemical toxins that are released, spines, thorns, that type of thing. All right, so when we look at the community structure, one thing we look at, and then remember the community is all the different species that are in an ecosystem, just the living species and the different kinds of species. So we want them to be diverse. And so species diversity is equal to the richness of species, so the number of different species that they contain, as well as the abundance of the species. So not only do we want to see an ecosystem with a great number of different species, but also that within each of those different species there's a good abundance of population as well. The dominant species in a community is going to have the highest biomass, or usually the most abundant in the community. So that's usually, when we look at an ecological pyramid, tends to be our producer level. Our producer level tends to have the greatest biomass because they are the main supporter of the ecosystem with the harnessing of photosynthesis. A keystone species is going to be one that tends to have a very important role, and so it can have a major effect on the community overall if something were to happen to them. So that's why they're known as a keystone species. So for instance, a good example is the sea otter. The sea otter eats sea urchins, which will actually destroy kelp forests. So the sea otter is known as a keystone species because if something were to happen to that sea otter, it would cause a major catastrophe to the entire food web because of the destruction of that kelp forest, which would then lead to the elimination of other organisms in the ecosystem as well. Any disturbance that is basically anything that changes the community that could cause a resource to be unavailable or to remove an organism. So it could be a fire, it could be a drought, it could be human activities coming in and clearing out land. So any kind of disturbance to the community that causes organisms to be removed or organisms to move, or causes some resource availability to be changed, whether it be increased or decreased, is considered a disturbance. And how the species compositions in an area transition over time, whether they increase or decrease, is called succession. So there are two main types of succession that we like to look at. Primary succession is initial starting of an ecosystem in an area. So there's no soil there at all. There's no life to begin with at all. It has never been there. So this is usually only found if we have a volcanic island form, and so it's barren volcanic rock that is being colonized, or if it's a glacier where no life has been at that point. So those are the two areas where we would see a primary succession, because there would be no soil or anything there to start with. And so the initial thing would be the wind or something, or other, some organism coming to the area, or wind or anything like that, bringing in waste deposits and things like that that would help to start to form a soil in which a lichen or something could start to grow. Secondary succession, on the other hand, is where we've got an existing community that is going to have some kind of disturbance, whether, again, that be a fire, human, it could even be the bringing in of some kind of resource, but something happens to change that ecosystem in some way, and so the community is going to adjust. So usually we look at it as a harmful thing, where if you had a fire, for instance, and you can see this in the picture, the first picture A, you have this fire, and then just a year later after the fire, you've already got some regrowth happening. And so that's considered secondary because there was already life in the area, there's already some soil to start with, some things have still survived, they're still there, you just have growth starting over again. All right, anything so far? Doing okay, Caleb? Okay. All right, so with ecosystems, again, this is all of the biotic and abiotic factors and how they interact. And there are two main interaction processes of either energy flow and chemical cycling. So we're going to look a little bit about food webs and how energy kind of flows through the organisms, and then we're also going to look at some of the geochemical cycles as well. So this is a big overview showing you how chemical and energy both flow and cycle through the different layers of an ecosystem. Key thing is to remember that the sun is where we get our primary energy for all life on Earth. So basically, if there were no producers, then life would most likely not survive on Earth. So from there, we have our primary producers. That's the main bottom part of an ecosystem, and that's where the energy is harnessed from the sun and converted through photosynthesis to provide their food source. And then primary consumers will eat those, and then we have secondary consumers above that, and so on and so forth. And then we also do have decomposers and detritivores, which will help with the breaking down and recycling of the matter and geochemical energy to get it recycled into the system again. So we're going to break this down a little bit. We're going to talk about the different trophic levels. So those are basically the feeding relationship. So one trophic level is a link in the structure, or basically a feeding level. So again, producer is one trophic level, primary consumer is the second trophic level, third trophic level is the secondary consumer, and then the tertiary consumer, and that's usually the highest that we'll have. And the transfer of the food energy goes from plants to herbivores. So herbivores are organisms that only eat plants, and so those are usually our primary consumers. Then our carnivores will usually be a secondary consumer because they are going to eat another meat organism. They're not going to necessarily eat plants, they're going to eat meat. And then we also have omnivores, which will eat both plants and animals. And then the decomposers, those are what will help recycle everything. So that's basically a food chain when you talk about a plant that's been eaten by one primary consumer, which then gets eaten by a secondary consumer. One chain or one flow from that plant to those two different organisms. Right, exactly, for Nitrite T-Rex to worm, yes. But that's not realistic because most food chain or most organisms will have more than one food source. So a food chain just gives you one idea of the flow, whereas a more realistic view of what an ecosystem looks like with the transfer of the energy through the food is with a food web, and that's when we put all the possible chains together, because that human doesn't just eat one thing or another. We might eat plants, we might eat fish, we might eat squid. We can eat all kinds of things. So this just shows you that a food web is all the different possible ways that energy and food can travel through the food web from one level to the next. And a species that as well could be at a different trophic level depending on what they're eating at that point in time. Okay, so for instance, let's see if I can find a good example here. The leopard seal, if it eats the bird, which eats the krill, which eats the phytoplankton, so that makes it a primary, secondary, that makes it a tertiary, whereas if we go, let's see, can I find one that makes it go faster? I don't think I can, too. I think he's a tertiary in all of these. That wasn't a very good example. How about the squid? We can do the squid. The squid can go from the plankton to the phytoplankton, so that makes him from the phytoplankton to the plankton. That's the primary consumer, which then makes him a secondary consumer. However, if we go to the other plankton and then to the krill, back to the phytoplankton, he becomes a tertiary. So that gives you an example how the squid can actually be a different trophic level depending on which source of food he's going for at that given time. Okay, so that's a more realistic view of what ecosystems look like. Lots of interchanging amongst them and lots of interacting. All right, this is just another same thing of what we were just talking about We go from sun to primary producers to primary consumers, which tend to be herbivores, to secondary consumers, which tend to be carnivores, but they could also be omnivores. And then we have our decomposers that are in the mix, and they're kind of at all levels. So you can see that these arrows kind of come off of each of the trophic levels, because your decomposers are going to be involved at every level in helping to break down and replenish our soil and replenish those waste products that are produced from each of the levels and things like that. But one key thing I like about this diagram is that it's showing that at each level we have heat being given off, and that is so important because the amount of energy that travels from one level to the next is going to constantly decrease as to what's available for that organism to use, because a lot of it is used up in the transfer process and a lot of it is given off as the non-usable form of heat. So that's something to keep in mind. So bringing us to how the amount of energy that is available, we look at the primary production. So primary production is the gross primary production, GPP, and this is the amount of light energy that is converted into the chemical energy, okay? The net primary production, the NPP, is the gross primary production minus the energy that's actually used by the producers for respiration, okay? So the NPP actually becomes what is available to the consumers, because not all of that light energy that's harnessed is actually going to be converted into usable chemical energy for those consumers. So that's something to keep in mind, because there is respiration and the processes itself. So that's something just to kind of keep in mind there. All right. Primary production and the amounts that we actually will get is dependent on the light availability. Obviously, if there's more depth, if the organism is deeper in the water, then there's less photosynthesis possible because there's less light. And then nutrient availability is also a big factor as to how much of that chemical energy can be converted to chemical. And that is nitrogen and phosphorus primarily are the two main ones that become a big factor. And we also have temperature and moisture that can affect our primary production. Okay, and this is just showing you that a nutrient-rich lake that supports algae growth is known as eutrophic. So again, this goes back to that energy transfer between the trophic levels. It's basically only 10% efficient, which just means that typically only about 10% of the energy that is available from one level to the next. Okay, so production efficiency, only a fraction of the energy is stored in food. Energy gets used up in respiration and lost as heat, and the energy flows through the ecosystem. So if we've got the plant being eaten by the caterpillar here, we can see that out of 200 joules, 100 joules of that energy is going to be as waste. 33 joules is going to be used for growth for the actual caterpillar, so new biomass, and 67 of those joules is used up in respiration. So it just kind of gives you an idea of how much of it is being used up in this process. So only 10% tends to be moved from one level to the next. So if you had 100 at the producer level, then only 1 would be at the primary consumer, and so on and so forth. Here it is, that's the same thing. So you got 1 million joules, only 10% moves to the primary producers. That's 10,000. Primary consumers, 1,000, 100, and then 10, so 10%. I think I said that incorrectly in the last one. I said 100 to 1, and it should have been 100 to 10. All right, so any questions on that transferring of energy and the amount of energy that's available? All right. So here are just what some pyramids of energy or biomass would look like, and again, it's similar to that one we were just looking at. Basically, they look the same. So biomass is basically the number of individuals or number of organisms that are in the actual level. the amount of energy that's at the H level is going to resemble it. So your majority, your biggest one is going to be your producer, and then as you move from the consumers to your tertiary consumers, your numbers are going to get smaller. That's all that's really saying. And because the amount of energy decreases so much as we move through the different levels, that's what limits the number of top-level carnivores we can have. In most food webs, the tertiary is the highest trophic level because of that. All right, so moving on to the matter cycle. So this is looking at the chemical flow here, the biogeochemical cycles. So looking at how these different nutrients cycle through both the organic and inorganic parts of our ecosystem. So the main ones that most everyone is concerned with are water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So if we look at the carbon cycle, you can see how it cycles through. Key things to remember with carbon is that it gets put into the atmosphere through cellular respiration, the burning of fossil fuels. It's taken out of the atmosphere and put back into the organic parts of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, because trees and plants will use the carbon dioxide to make the glucose. And it also can be put back into the inorganic parts of the ecosystem through carbon compounds in water and decomposition. Okay? So it's put in to the atmosphere, it's added to the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels and respiration. It's removed primarily through photosynthesis, but also decomposition. In the nitrogen cycle, we've got bacteria that play a huge role in the nitrogen cycle. They either do nitrogen fixation, in which it becomes N2, the nitrification, in which we convert from ammonium to nitrate, which is absorbed by the plants. That's one of the nitrate is absorbed by the plants. That's also done by bacteria. And denitrification is where nitrogen is actually released to the atmosphere, also done by bacteria. So bacteria play a big role in the nitrogen cycle and the movement of nitrogen in and out of the atmosphere. So those are the three main terms you kind of need to be familiar with. Nitrogen fixation is when the nitrogen is converted to N2, okay, by the plants, by the bacteria, to plants by the bacteria. The nitrification is when ammonium is converted to nitrate, which has been converted to nitrite to nitrate, that's a mouthful, and that gets absorbed by the plants. And then denitrification is when the bacteria release nitrogen to the atmosphere. Something to keep in mind with the nitrogens and the phosphorus and sulfur is acid rain. So acid precipitation, it can be, snow as well, is anything that has a pH less than 5.6. So if you remember on the pH scale, anything lower than 7 is an acid, anything higher than 7 is a base. So to be considered an acid precipitation or an acid rain, it has to actually even be lower than 5.6, okay? And it's usually caused by the burning of fossil fuels and woods that releases nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides into the air. They react with the water and produce sulfuric and nitric acid. And so when they fall back down to the earth, it's known as acid rain, and it can kill plants, it can kill organisms because it changes the soil and the water pH. So it can have a very big effect on our ecosystems if it continues to be a big problem in an area. Another thing to keep in mind with toxins is biological magnification, and this is when toxins become more concentrated as we move through the trophic levels in a food web. So they can't be broken down and actually will magnify in concentration as you move up the food web. So you can see here from the phytoplankton, we have a 0.025 parts per million of the toxin. And then when you get to the zooplankton, which is the next level, it's 0.123, so that's increased. If we move up to the smelt, it's 1.04 the trout 4.83, and by the time it gets to the herring, the gull eggs, then we're at 124 parts per million. So it has magnified a lot through the eating of these different levels of the food web. So they become more concentrated, and that's what's called a magnification of those toxins. And it's a huge problem with mercury in fish is one of the biggest problems we have with that. And it's one of the reasons why we have some pesticides and things that we no longer use because we were finding that was happening with the magnification happening. Greenhouse effect is another thing just to remember that this is the absorption of heat from the earth, and it's due to certain greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and water vapor. It's actually a normal thing, a natural thing that our earth has. The earth is meant to retain some of that radiation from the sun that would normally escape. The problem is that with some of our burning of fossil fuels, we are increasing some of these gases at an alarming rate, which is causing the earth to heat up faster. So although we need the greenhouse effect to maintain our temperature on Earth, the global warming or the burning of fossil fuels is adding to that, and too much can be disastrous, of course. So we can actually look at a graph here that shows us how that is affecting, how those burning of fossil fuels are causing an increase in some of those gases. You can see the carbon dioxide back in 1960. We were looking at, somewhere about 315, and now in 2000 it's all the way up to about almost 370 in the carbon dioxide concentration. And as that has happened, with some changes, some dips, we've gotten some increased temperatures coming with as well. Probably is why Florida gets hotter every year. Yes, definitely. Seems like we're having less and less of a winter. It's also something that I think is interesting is if you notice the seasons don't seem as defined as they once were. And I don't know if it's just because we're in Florida, but we really don't have a defined spring, summer, fall, and winter. They kind of all run together anymore. So that's another thing we have summer and fall. Yes, exactly. That is true. All right. So global warming, is unfortunately a thing that's happening because of this increased carbon dioxide, which is showing increases in temperature. So scientists are continuing to make models to try to predict how these levels will affect our Earth. Several studies actually predict that the doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere will cause a 2°C increase in the average temperature of Earth. We already know that the rising temperatures are causing our ice caps to melt, which not only causes floods in those coastal areas, but it also changes the temperature and the flow of the currents of our oceans, as well as the salinity, because the ice cap is fresh water being dumped into our oceans. So it's definitely something that as humans we need to really start making more of a focus on stabilizing our use of fossil fuels. But it's funny, my husband says that, and I think this is something important to remember as well, that as humans are burning fossil fuels and we are definitely adding to the problem, but we also have to remember that if you stick ice in a cooler long enough, it's eventually going to melt. So naturally, nature is going to lead to the melting of the polar ice caps and the warming of the Earth and things like that. I think that's a natural thing that is going to happen regardless. But I think humans are definitely adding to it by increasing that rate with all of our burning of fossil fuels. So, and this is just showing us another way that some of our fossil fuel burning has affected us is getting rid of our ozone, which the ozone is actually a layer that protects us from the UV light from the sun, and we are any chlorine-containing compounds actually erode the ozone. So that's one of the reasons why there's been more of a limit on different types of aerosol cans and things like that, because of the chlorine contained in those early on. Aerosol can products would cause a major impact on our ozone layer. And so you can see here the thickness of the ozone layer has decreased over the years based on our human actions. So the 4 major threats to biodiversity: habitat destruction, of course, introduced species or invasive species, so bringing in non-native species to an area, whether it's intentional or non-intentional, because sometimes they hitch a ride on the ships coming from one area to the next. Overexploitation, harvesting wild plants and animals, and basically to the point of extinction. And any food chain disruption, so when we have keystone species in particular being affected and becoming extinct, that's going to have major impacts on our biodiversity and ecosystems. So those are the 4 main things. So wanted to just, I know it's about an hour here, so I want to go ahead and finish up, but I have some practice questions, so we can kind of see how you do on some practice questions that would deal with the ecology stuff. So if you look at this is a food web. So the following is a food web for a meadow habitat that occupies 25.6 kilometers squared. The primary producer's biomass is uniformly distributed throughout the habitat and totals 1,500 kilograms per kilometer squared. So you take a look at that, and the question is, which of the following is most likely result at the completion of the project? And so the developers have approved a project that will permanently reduce the primary producer's biomass, so the meadow grasses, by 50% and remove all rabbits and deer. So the rabbits, deer will be removed, and the meadow grass is going to be reduced 50%. So which of those following statements is most likely the result of this project? Based on the information that's given, what could you conclude? So Caleb, you want to read through those and make a choice, see what you think? B. All right, so yes, very good. B is correct. So the biomass of the coyotes will be dramatically reduced, and the reason for that, the deer and the rabbit are gone. So its main source of food is gone. So we can't really, when it starts talking about 6 kilograms and the biomass of the hops, the 0.5, all of those like A and D, there will be 50% fewer voles and 90%. We don't have enough information to be able to answer in one of those ways or the other. So that's why those cannot be, okay? As far as like coyotes switching prey preferences and outcompeting the hawks, again, there's not enough information for us to know that that would happen for sure. Obviously, the coyotes are going to have to find either a different ecosystem to go to or a different food source, but we don't know exactly what that would be. So the most logical answer here is that the biomass of the coyotes will be dramatically reduced. Excellent job on that. All right, let's go to the next one. Yeah, and that's good, because sometimes, you know, they'll want to confuse with the numbers, and it's not always a numbers thing. So that's a good strategy to see if you can answer it without the numbers is perfect. All right, so here we have a diagram of ecological succession taking place. So the diagram shows the progression of ecological events after a fire in an area and a particular ecosystem. So based on the diagram, which of the following best explains why the oak trees are later replaced by other trees? So which one do you think that is? All right, so B is not correct. And again, one of the reasons why, so it says oak trees alter the pH of the soil, making the forest better suited for shrubs and other trees. One of the things that makes me, that as a clue that this is not the right answer is if that's the case, then there should be more shrubs in these last two pictures on this progression, and there's none. So I don't think so that's not going to be the answer, because if that was the case, then there would be more shrubs. C is not correct either, you're right, because roots of shrubs would proliferate, and again, there's no shrubs there, so it can't be that one. There's not enough information to be D. Succumbing to environmental pollutants more readily, I mean, that's a subjective thing. That's not anything we could determine based on this. So it's got to be A. The other trees grow taller than the oak trees and form a dense canopy. So the other trees are these big ones right here. Yeah, the pine trees are taller. So the pine trees, these other trees are taller than the oak trees. They're not at first, but then eventually they do, and that is why we're going to reduce our number of oak trees, because they're going to end up blocking out all of the sun, or some of the sunlight. Okay, so yeah, definitely would be A. And that also explains why there's less brush and shrubs underneath here as well, because of that dense canopy. Okay? All right, and we got this one. This is looking at testosterone oxidoreductase is a liver enzyme that regulates testosterone levels in alligators. One study compared testosterone oxidoreductase activity between male and female alligators from Lake Woodruff, a relatively pristine environment, and from Lake Apopko, an area that has suffered severe contamination. So the graph above depicts the findings of that study. So it's kind of giving you the activity for the two different sites. The data in the graph best support which of the following claims? Right, B, definitely. So, because B, the Apopka is the area where the contamination was. You can see there's a huge difference in the activity in the females from Woodruff, where there's a pristine, no contamination, versus the other area where there is. A big difference. So it's definitely not elevating, which is what A is trying to say. We definitely have a decrease. And if you look at the males, which C and D are referring to, the males are relatively similar. There's not a big enough difference to be substantial there. So good job on that. All right, so here's a gridded response. So this is what the gridded response thing would look like. Over here to the right, you can see you have where you would write your numbers in at the top, and then there's the bubbles that you would bubble in to go with the numbers. You want to make sure that your number is either going to end all the way to the right-hand side or begin all the way at the left-hand side. Okay, so that there's no confusion as to what the number should actually be. So here's a sample question that deals with the ecology we've been talking about. If we look at population growth here, it says use the graph above to calculate the mean rate of population growth between day 3 and day 5. Give your answer to the nearest whole number. So that's important as well. They don't want any decimals. They want it to the nearest whole number. What do you think the mean rate of population growth would be between 3 and 5? That's okay. What do you think you got? And then we'll calculate it. Just 567? No, that's quite a bit off. So let's take a look at what we're going to do here. So all we have to do is find the rate for 5, which is probably about, what, 890 or so. And there is some leeway on this. So let's just say 890. And then we need to subtract day 3. So day 3 is pretty close to 200. So that would end up being, what's that, 690? Did I do the math right? Yeah. Okay, so does that make sense? Okay. So they do give you some leeway on those numbers. It's not going to have to be exact because obviously you're reading the graph, so there is a leeway. And actually, let me pull up real quick. I just want to just going to pull up real quick the what the range is. I think it's a good 10-point difference that they give you. I don't have it right in front of me. I'll have to look at it later. But it does, just so you know, and just so everybody knows, when you do these gridded response or math. Yeah. Oh, I see. It's really complicated on it. Yeah. That's just a basic. Then you can have some leeway in the number. But you would want to put it in, so, you know, if I was to grid it, I'm going to say 6 and then 9. Oh, and then I would actually want to color in those numbers as well. Okay, so that's how you would do your gridded response. Alrighty. And you don't have to show your math for the gridded response, so that's something to keep in mind. You don't have to show math for that one. But on the free response, you want to make sure you show math. I think I have one more practice question here. So this one's looking at the carbon flow in a grassland ecosystem, and the question is asking how much carbon in grams per meter squared is released into the atmosphere as a result of the metabolic activity of herbivores. Give your answer to the nearest whole number. So your herbivores are right here. In between the grass and the predators, and it gives you some numbers kind of coming off them and stuff. So how much carbon would be released based on these for those herbivores? What do you think? Right, they're gaining 125, good. Right, they're not giving that off. What do we know that they're giving off already? 5, good. They're giving off 5 as being passed on to the predators. Any other thing they're giving off? 60, good. The 60 going down to the decomposers. So how much is that total? Not just 60, but they're giving off both of them. the 60 going to the decomposers and the 5 going to the predators. So you have to add those together for 65, right? And they had 125 coming in. So what's left to get rid of for respiration, or the metabolic process that they called it, which would be respiration? Right, good. So you would take the 125 that they're gaining and subtract the 65 that they are losing, and then that leaves with 60 left. So that's where the 60 comes from, and that would be the answer. And so you would just write that in your grid and then also bubble it in. Does that make sense as to how we got that answer, why that makes sense? Okay, good. Yeah, but that was a good job recognizing that they got the 125 going in, and then we could see that they were going to be losing 60 to the decomposers, 5 to the predators, so that's 65 of that 125 that's being used there. So that means that the rest of it has to be released as part of their metabolic respiration. All right. Yeah, bubble in my numbers. And notice that I'm writing, for me, I just find it's easier to make sure my last number is the number all the way to the right. But they will take it either way, starting all the way to the left or all the way to the right, or ending all the way to the right, one or the other. Okay? All right, and so those are the practice questions and some of the ecology review. Did you have any other questions? All right, Caleb, well, thank you for joining me, and we will be doing another session on Tuesday, and I will go ahead and make this a recording, and we're adding it to the AP exam part of our course, so that if you wanted to go back through or look at anything again, you can, okay? I just finished the recording on the ecology review, and I just noticed that I made a big mistake on this question about the population growth. We not only have to look at the change in the numbers, so this would be my change in number of individuals here. Oh, hold on. Let me... I can get my pen to start working here. So this is the change in population number. But we also have to do change in time, which in this case was 2 days. 5 minus 3 is 2 days. So you have to then divide, the 690 has to be divided by 2 to get 345 as our mean rate of population growth. Okay, so I just wanted to go back and make that change there. So this is not correct. The 690 is not correct because I forgot a very vital part of our population change. To find the mean rate, you not only have to do the change in population number, which was the about 890 to 200, and that subtract that, so that's 690, but you also then have to divide it by the change in time. And the change in time was 5 days versus 3 days, so 5 minus 3 is 2, and so that leaves us with the division of the 690 by 2, giving us the 345 as the mean population rate here. So I want to apologize for my confusion on that and for doing that incorrectly the first time, and wanted to go back and add that to our little recording here. So it should be 345 is the answer for this particular one, not 690. cross out that 690 because it should be 345. And hopefully that makes sense of why you had to do that. You have to do, to find the mean rate of population growth, you have to do the change in the number divided by the change in the time. Okay? And that's where we get that number. Okay, so I apologize for that. I realized I made that mistake after I stopped talking and wanted to go back and fix it. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. Thank you.